I asked my brother-in-law for a massage, and he crossed the line. It started as an innocent moment, a gesture of comfort in the absence of my husband, but it spiraled into something that neither of us could control. What happens when a spark of forbidden desire ignites a fire that threatens to burn everything to the ground? My marriage, my family, and the life I thought I wanted. My marriage, my family, and the life I thought I wanted. Before we dive into this story of betrayal, heartbreak, and self-discovery, make sure to subscribe and stay with us until the end to see how it all unfolds. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments. I asked my brother-in-law for a massage, and he crossed the line. That moment is seared into my memory, replaying over and over as if trying to make sense of how it all unraveled. It wasn't planned. It wasn't intentional. Or at least, that's what I tell myself. But the truth is, the tension had been there for months, perhaps even years. It was a spark that we both ignored, pretending it wasn't real, until it was too late. It all began innocently enough, as these things often do. The evening sun bathed the living room in a golden glow as I fluffed the cushions on the couch. My husband, Daniel, had just left for another work trip, a regular occurrence in our household. His absence had become so routine that I barely noticed the silence anymore. Marriage was supposed to be a partnership, but lately it felt more like cohabitation. We had our routines, our roles, and our shared calendar of logistics. But love? Passion? Those had faded into the background, like a once vivid painting now dulled with age. And then there was Ian, Daniel's younger brother. Where Daniel was calm and measured, Ian was energetic and playful, a perpetual jokester who always seemed to find the fun in everything. He was single, unattached, and lived life as if there were no rules to follow. Over the years, he'd become a fixture in our home, stopping by for dinners, helping Daniel with projects, and even babysitting our dog when we were away. I had always thought of Ian as family, but lately his presence stirred something unfamiliar in me, something I wasn't ready to confront. That evening, Ian arrived unannounced, carrying a 6-pack of craft beer and a grin that could light up a room. "Thought you might need some company," he said, plopping down on the couch. "You know, since Danny's off saving the world again." I laughed, though his comment stung. "I don't mind the quiet," I lied, handing him a glass of water instead of indulging in the beer. "It's peaceful." An exhaling sigh, Ian stretched out on the couch, his arm resting casually along the back of it. "You know, you're going to turn into a hermit if you keep this up. When's the last time you did something fun?" "Define fun," I shot back, rolling my eyes. "Something that doesn't involve organizing closets or binge-watching true crime documentaries." I smirked. "Well, my to-do list disagrees." He shook his head, leaning closer. "You're too young to let life pass you by, Claire." There was something in the way he said my name. Soft, familiar, almost intimate. I quickly looked away, brushing off the moment. He stared at me consciously, brushing off the moment. Later that evening, after dinner, I found myself sitting on the patio with Ian, the warm summer air buzzing with the sounds of cicadas. The conversation had shifted to lighter topics, but there was an undercurrent of something unspoken between us. A tension I couldn't quite name. "My shoulders are killing me," I muttered absent-mindedly, rubbing the back of my neck. Ian leaned forward, his expression suddenly serious. "I can help with that. I'm basically a pro at asking anyone." I laughed, but the ache in my shoulders was real, and the idea of relief was too tempting to pass up. "All right, but if you make it worse, I'm suing." He chuckled, moving behind me as I shifted in my chair. His hands were warm and firm as they pressed into my shoulders, working out the knots with a surprising gentleness. "You're tense," he murmured, his breath close enough to stir the hairs on the back of my neck. I closed my eyes, trying to focus on the massage, and not the fact that his hands felt different. Not like Daniel's. Ian's touch was deliberate, his thumbs kneading into the tight muscles with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "That feels good," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "See? Told you I'm a pro," he teased, but there was an edge to his voice that made my eyes snap open. I turned to look at him, our faces suddenly closer than they should have been. For a brief moment, neither of us moved, the air between us thick and heavy. His eyes searched mine, and I could feel the question unspoken on his lips, but before anything could happen, I pulled away, standing abruptly. "Thanks, Ian. I feel much better now," I said, forcing a smile as I put distance between us. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Any time." That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The memory of his hands on my shoulders played on a loop in my mind. It wasn't just the massage. It was the way I felt, the way my body had responded. It was the flutter in my chest and the heat that rose to my cheeks when our eyes met. It was wrong, and I knew it, but it was also undeniable. The days that followed were a whirlwind of normalcy. I busied myself with work, errands, and phone calls with Daniel, who was oblivious to the storm brewing inside me. Ian didn't visit again that week, and I told myself it was for the best. But the absence of his presence was like a void, and I hated myself for missing him. Deeply sorrow laced through my mind. The next time Ian came over, I was determined to keep things light and casual. He arrived with a toolbox, offering to fix a leaky faucet in the kitchen. "Can't have my brother's wife living like this," he joked, flashing that boyish grin that always disarmed me. As he worked, I hovered nearby, handing him tools and making small talk, but the unspoken tension was still there, lingering like a shadow in the corner of the room. When he finished, he stood up, wiping his hands on a towel. "All set. You owe me a coffee for that one." "Deal," I said, grateful for the excuse to keep things neutral. But as he reached for his keys, he hesitated, turning back to me. "Claire?" I looked at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "Yeah." He seemed to struggle for words, his gaze locking onto mine. "You know you can talk to me, right? About anything." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. "Of course. Why wouldn't I?" He hesitated, then gave a small shrug. Sometimes I feel like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." I laughed nervously. "That's dramatic, even for you." "Maybe, but it doesn't mean it's not true." He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. "You deserve to be happy, Claire." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. His words hung in the air, echoing in the corners of my mind. It was the following weekend, and the house was eerily quiet again, save for the faint hum of the dishwasher. Daniel was still away, his text updates brief and mechanical, mostly about work schedules and how his meetings were progressing. I had grown accustomed to these solo weekends, but this time they felt heavier, charged with an energy I didn't want to acknowledge. Devon retreated slowly into the distance, alone and worried, the children sleeping and silently staring at me. I was in the middle of folding laundry when Ian's name popped up on my phone. Ian, mind if I stop by? I have something for you. For a moment I hesitated. My heart quickened, not because I feared seeing him, but because I feared what seeing him did to me. But curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, won out. Me, sure, I'm just home. An hour later, Ian was at the door, holding a brown paper bag with a small grin. Thought you might like these, he said, handing it over. Inside were pastries from the new cafe downtown. The one I'd mentioned weeks ago but hadn't found time to visit. You didn't have to, I said, though the gesture warmed me in a way I didn't expect. He shrugged, stepping inside. Consider it a thank you for letting me crash your peace and quiet last week. We sat in the kitchen, sipping coffee and sharing bites of the pastries. It was easy, comfortable, but I couldn't ignore the way his eyes lingered just a fraction too long, or how my pulse raced whenever our hands brushed, reaching for the same plate. So, how's the work trip? Ian asked, his tone casual but his eyes probing. Daniel's busy as always, I replied, trying to sound indifferent. You know how it is. Ian leaned back in his chair, his arms crossing over his chest. Yeah, he's always been a workaholic. Guess some things never change. There was a flicker of something in his expression. Frustration, perhaps? I looked away, focusing on my coffee. My stomach turned, and my chest heaved. You don't have to keep pretending, he said softly. I froze, my gaze snapping back to him. Pretending about what? That everything's fine, that you're fine. His voice was gentle but insistent, as though he could see right through me. I nodded. Then, with his face turning closer, I'm fine, Ian, I said, a little too quickly. Sure you are. His lips curved into a faint smile, but his eyes held something deeper, something that made me feel exposed. As the days went on, Ian began to stop by more frequently, always with some excuse, a tool he'd forgotten, a question about Daniel, or something he needed help with. I told myself it was innocent, that we were just family, but deep down, I knew better. One evening, he showed up with a bottle of wine, insisting I needed a break. You've been running around all week, he said, pouring 2 glasses before I could protest. Just one drink. For me. The first glass turned into 2, and before I knew it, we were sitting on the couch, laughing about childhood memories and old family stories. The wine had loosened my guard, and I found myself talking more openly than I had in months. You know, I said, swirling the wine in my glass, sometimes I wonder if this is it. If this is all there is. Ian tilted his head, his gaze steady. What do you mean? Marriage, life. It's just routines, you know? The spark fades and you just exist. His expression darkened and he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. You deserve more than that, Claire. You deserve to feel alive. His words hit me like a jolt, and I quickly looked away, my cheeks flushing. That's easier said than done. Maybe, he said, his voice low, but it doesn't mean it's impossible. Unless, the next morning, I woke up with a headache, not from the wine, but from the swirl of emotions I couldn't quite sort through. Ian had left shortly after our conversation, but his words lingered, haunting me in the quiet hours of the night. The massage that changed everything. A week later, it happened. It had been another long day, and I was sitting on the couch, rubbing my neck absent-mindedly. Ian had stopped by to fix a light fixture, and as usual, he lingered longer than necessary. He lay down. "Your shoulders again?" he asked, his tone light. "Yeah, I guess I've just been tense lately," I replied without thinking. He walked over, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "You know, you could just let me help. I told you I'm a pro." I hesitated, my heart racing. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Why not?" "Because—" I trailed off, unable to find the words. "Claire," he said softly, stepping closer, "it's just a massage, that's all." His tone was reassuring, and for a moment I let myself believe it. I nodded, turning my back to him. As his hands began to work over my shoulders, I tried to focus on anything else: the ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator. But it was impossible. His touch was firm yet gentle, and every movement sent a wave of heat through me. "Relax," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear. "I am," I lied, my body stiff with tension that had nothing to do with my shoulders. "You're not," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're holding back." I turned to look at him, his face so close to mine that I could see the flecks of gold in his eyes. For a moment, the world seemed to stop, and then, as if pulled by an invisible force, our faces inched closer. "Ian," I whispered, my voice trembling. He froze, his gaze locked onto mine. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice strained. And I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. The moment passed as quickly as it had come. I stood abruptly, putting distance between us. "I think you should go," I said, my voice shaking. Ian's jaw tightened and he nodded. "Yeah, I should." The door closed behind him. I sank onto the couch, my heart pounding. The line we had danced around for months was no longer a distant boundary. It was right in front of us, and we had come dangerously close to crossing it. Instead of returning to the rooms we hadn't used in 2 years, I held onto the bed. The days after that moment with Ian were a blur. I tried to throw myself into distractions, cleaning, errands, even calling Daniel more often than usual. His voice on the phone was distant, filled with updates about work and logistics, but devoid of the warmth I once craved from him. And yet, every time I hung up, I felt like a fraud. The truth was, Ian lingered in my mind more than I cared to admit. His touch, his voice, the way his eyes seemed to see past all my walls. Those thoughts consumed me, but I told myself it didn't matter. Nothing had happened, at least not yet. It was late one Friday night when Ian texted me. He said, "Ian, you up?" I stared at the screen, my heart racing. It was such a simple message, but the weight of it felt unbearable. Against my better judgment, I replied, "Me. Yeah, everything okay?" "Ian, not really. Can I come over? Just need to talk." For a moment, I considered saying no. I knew the risks, but something in me, a dangerous mix of curiosity and longing, won out. And then, me. Sure. Minutes later, Ian was at the door. He looked different somehow, less confident, almost vulnerable. He stepped inside, running a hand through his hair as he let out a heavy sigh. "Oh, long day?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He nodded, collapsing onto the couch. "You could say that. I sat beside him, leaving a safe distance between us. "What's going on?" He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the floor. I just, I don't know, Claire. Lately, everything feels so complicated." "Tell me about it," I said, half joking. He looked up then, his eyes locking onto mine. "No, I mean it. I can't stop thinking about you, about us." My breath caught in my throat. "Ian, there is no us." "Maybe not," he said, leaning closer. "But don't tell me you don't feel it too." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. The truth hung heavy in the air between us, undeniable. "Ian, this is wrong," I whispered, though my voice lacked conviction. "Maybe it is," he said, his voice low, "but that doesn't make it any less real." Before I could respond, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. It was such a small gesture, but it sent a jolt through me. My instinct was to pull away, to put an end to whatever this was before it went any further, but I didn't move. Instead, I let his fingers intertwine with mine, the warmth of his touch both comforting and electrifying. For a moment, we just sat there in silence, the weight of our shared reality pressing down on us. And then, as if compelled by some invisible force, he leaned in. When his lips met mine, it was like the world fell away. There was no guilt, no hesitation, just the raw, undeniable connection that we had both tried so hard to ignore. His kiss was gentle at first, testing, as if giving me a chance to pull away. But when I didn't, it deepened, the intensity building with every second. My hands found their way to his shoulders, pulling him closer, even as my mind screamed at me to stop. This was wrong, so wrong. But in that moment, it didn't matter. All that mattered was the way he made me feel. Alive, seen, wanted. When we finally broke apart, breathless and wide-eyed, reality came crashing back. I shouldn't have done that," I stammered, pulling away. "Claire," he said, his voice steady, "I don't regret it, not for a second." His words were like a punch to the gut. How could he be so certain when I felt like I was unraveling? "It sounds like your language is a bit more sharp. It'll come to me later." "Ian, this can't happen," I said, my voice trembling. "Daniel is your brother." "I know," he said softly, "and I hate myself for it. But I can't help how I feel. September 10th. Neither could I. And that was the problem. The days that followed were a whirlwind of stolen glances and whispered conversations. We tried to keep our distance, to pretend nothing had happened, but it was impossible. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. One evening, Ian showed up unexpectedly, his expression tense. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Ian, I don't think this is a good idea," I said, my heart racing. "I can't keep doing this," he said, his voice raw, pretending like everything's normal when it's not. "I know," I said, tears welling in my eyes. "But what choice do we have?" "We could stop pretending," he said, his gaze piercing. "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying we stop running from this. From us." The words hung heavy in the air, and for a moment I considered it. The thought of giving in, of finally embracing what we both wanted, was intoxicating. But the reality was far more complicated. "I can't," I said, shaking my head. I can't do that to Daniel, even if it means being miserable for the rest of your life, he asked, his voice filled with frustration. I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. It's not that simple, Ian. No, he said, stepping closer. It's not, but maybe it could be, if we just let it. And that's why we create it. His words were both a comfort and a torment. I wanted to believe him, to believe that we could somehow make this work, but deep down, I knew better. I need time, I said finally, my voice breaking. I need to think. Take all the time you need, he said, his tone softer now. I'll be here when you're ready. That night, as I lay in bed, my mind raced with possibilities. I thought about Ian, about Daniel, about the life I had built and the one I could lose. No matter which path I chose, someone would get hurt. And then without me, this life that at first seemed so complete and peaceful fell apart quickly and desperately as the life collapsed around me. And the worst part? I wasn't sure I even deserved to make that choice. The air between us was electric, a taut string stretched to its limit, ready to snap at the slightest pull. Days turned into weeks, and while Ian tried to give me space, he was always there. In my thoughts, in the corners of my home, lingering like a storm waiting to break. Daniel's absence seemed to amplify everything. He was gone more often, the calls shorter, his voice distracted. I told myself I wasn't looking for something outside my marriage. I was trying to survive inside it. But Ian was different. He didn't fill the empty spaces Daniel left. He created new ones I didn't know I had. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the living room, Ian showed up again. There was no pretense this time, no excuse about tools or errands. He simply stood at the door, his expression unreadable. I know I shouldn't be here, he said quietly. Then why are you? I asked, my voice trembling. Because I can't stay away. I should have closed the door. I should have told him to leave, to walk away, before we crossed the line again. But instead, I stepped aside, letting him in. Exhale, inhale. We sat in silence at first, the weight of our unspoken words filling the room. He looked at me like he was searching for something, some sign that I felt the same pull he did. And of course, I did. You're quiet tonight, he said, his voice soft. I shrugged, avoiding his gaze. What's there to say? A lot, he said, leaning forward. Like how you feel. What you want. What I want doesn't matter, I whispered, my hands fidgeting in my lap. It does to me, he said firmly. I looked up then, meeting his eyes. There was no hesitation in them, no doubt. He believed every word he said, and for a moment, I wanted to believe them too. The space between us seemed to shrink as he reached out, his fingers brushing mine. It was such a small gesture, but it felt monumental, like crossing a threshold we could never return from. Claire, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, tell me to stop, and I will. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. Instead, I leaned forward, closing the distance between us. When our lips met, it was like the world fell away. The kiss was soft at first, hesitant, as if testing the waters. But it quickly deepened, a surge of passion and desperation that left me breathless. It was as if a lake, whose bottom was full of dark secrets, had left me breathless. We pulled apart, our foreheads resting against each other, as we tried to catch our breath. This is crazy, I murmured, my heart racing. Maybe, he said, his hand gently cupping my cheek. But it's real. Air? I closed my eyes, leaning into his touch. For the first time in years, I felt alive, like I was seen, truly seen. Then my mind started to doubt my feelings. The rest of the evening was a blur of stolen moments and whispered confessions. We didn't go further than that kiss, but it felt just as intimate, just as dangerous. When Ian finally left, the house felt emptier than ever. I sat on the couch, replaying the evening in my mind, torn between the exhilaration of what had happened and the guilt gnawing at the edges of my conscience. The following week was a whirlwind of secrecy and tension. Ian and I found excuses to see each other: a quick coffee, a drive to the store, a chance meeting at a family gathering. Each interaction was charged, the air between us thick with everything we weren't saying. But it was also dangerous. The more time we spent together, the harder it became to hide the connection between us. Daniel called one evening, his voice cheerful as he talked about his upcoming trip home. "Can't wait to see you," he said. "It's been too long." "Yeah," I replied, forcing a smile he couldn't see. "Me too." But the truth was, I wasn't ready to face him. Not with everything that had happened. Not with Ian still lingering in the shadows of my life. The encounter that changed everything. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon when Ian showed up unannounced again. I opened the door, surprised to see him soaked through, his hair plastered to his forehead. "What are you doing here?" I asked, pulling him inside. "I needed to see you," he said, his voice urgent. I grabbed a towel, handing it to him as he shrugged off his wet jacket. "Ian, this is getting complicated? Messy?" he interrupted, stepping closer. "Yeah, I know. But I don't care." "I do," I said, my voice trembling. "This isn't fair. To Daniel, to us." "Fair?" He laughed bitterly. "Nothing about this is fair, Claire, but that doesn't make it any less real." I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I can't keep doing this." "Then tell me to leave," he said, his tone challenging. "Tell me you don't feel the same way and I'll walk out that door." My silence was answer enough. I was mirroring their efforts. The tension between us snapped, and before I knew it, he was pulling me into his arms, his lips crashing against mine. This kiss was different, urgent, hungry, as if we were both afraid it might be our last. The tension gnawed. We stumbled toward the couch, our hands exploring, our breaths mingling. Every thought, every worry melted away, leaving only the raw intensity of the moment. More voices fed, but just as quickly as it began, I pulled away, my chest heaving. "I can't," I said, tears streaming down my face. "Claire," he said, reaching for me. "Claire." "No," I said firmly, stepping back. "This has to stop." He stood there, his expression torn between frustration and heartbreak. "I'm not giving up on you," he said quietly, and didn't respond. I couldn't. As he walked out the door, the weight of my choices settled on my shoulders. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The days after Ian's departure were excruciating. The house felt hollow, and I found myself glancing at my phone constantly, half hoping for a text from him, half praying he wouldn't send one. But Ian stayed true to his word. He didn't give up. It started subtly, with small gestures designed to reel me back in. A text saying, "Thinking of you." A bouquet of sunflowers on my doorstep, no card attached, but unmistakably from him. And then, one evening, a knock at the door. I opened it cautiously, my breath hitching when I saw him standing there. He looked unsure, almost vulnerable, a far cry from the confident man I had grown used to. He was wearing a dark blue shirt, suit, and high-top white button-down. I couldn't stay away, he admitted, his voice soft. Not after everything. Ian, we can't, I started, but he cut me off. Hi, please, he said, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Just let me talk. We sat in the living room, the tension between us palpable. Ian leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, as he ran a hand through his hair. I know this isn't easy for you, he said, but you can't tell me you don't feel it too. This connection between us. It doesn't matter what I feel, I said, my voice trembling. What matters is that it's wrong. No. Wrong for who? He asked, his tone frustrated. For Daniel? For us? Or for the life you think you're supposed to have? His words hit me like a punch to the gut because they held a truth I didn't want to confront. I had spent so long living in the shadows of what I thought a good wife, a good person should be, that I had forgotten what it felt like to live for myself. And when I came to the world of women, I found no one to live for me safe. I don't know, I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. Ian reached out, his hand gently covering mine. Then let me help you figure it out. See? That night, we crossed the line completely. What started as a tentative touch quickly escalated into something far more intense. His lips found mine, and this time, I didn't pull away. We moved together, our bodies drawn to each other as if by some magnetic force. Every touch, every kiss, was charged with an intensity I hadn't felt in years. This was true love. It was just a matter of time. As we lay tangled on the couch afterward, the reality of what we had done began to sink in. I stared at the ceiling, my heart racing with a mix of exhilaration and dread. This changes everything, I murmured. It doesn't have to, Ian said, his voice steady. We'll take it one step at a time. No one has to know. His words were meant to reassure me, but they only deepened the pit of guilt in my stomach. The web of secrets. Over the next few weeks, Ian and I fell into a dangerous routine. He would stop by when Daniel was away, and we would steal moments together, each one more intense than the last. Every encounter left me both elated and hollow, the weight of our secret pressing down on me like a lead blanket. We were careful. At least, we thought we were. But secrets have a way of seeping into the cracks, no matter how tightly you try to seal them. One afternoon, I was in the kitchen when Daniel called unexpectedly. Hey, just wanted to check in, he said, his voice cheerful. How's everything at home? Fine, I replied, forcing a smile even though he couldn't see it. Nothing out of the ordinary. That's good, he said. Listen, I've been thinking. Maybe when I get back, we can take a weekend trip, just the two of us. The suggestion caught me off guard, and I hesitated. That sounds nice, I said finally, though the idea filled me with dread. How could I spend a romantic weekend with Daniel when my heart was tangled up with Ian? Later that evening, Ian came over, his expression dark. What's wrong? I asked as he stepped inside. Daniel called me, he said, running a hand through his hair. He said he's planning a trip for you two. I stared at him, my stomach twisting. And Ashila Shtaril, Ashila Shtaril, and I don't know how I'm supposed to handle that, he admitted, his voice raw. Claire, this isn't sustainable, sneaking around, pretending like everything's fine. It's driving me crazy. Do you think it's easy for me? I shot back, my voice rising. I'm the one living this double life, Ian. I'm the one who has to look Daniel in the eye and pretend nothing's wrong. Then don't, he said, stepping closer. Don't pretend. Tell him the truth. The suggestion sent a wave of panic through me. I can't do that, I said, shaking my head. It would destroy him. And what about you? He asked, his voice softening. What's it doing to you? The conversation ended in silence, neither of us willing to take the next step. But the cracks in our secret were beginning to show, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The days after Ian left felt like walking on a tightrope. The air in the house was heavy, filled with the tension of my secrets and the ever-present dread of what might come next. Daniel had returned home, his presence a jarring reminder of everything I had been hiding. He was attentive in ways he hadn't been for months, small gestures like asking about my day or surprising me with dinner plans. It was as though he could sense the distance between us and was trying to bridge it, but every kind act only deepened my guilt. The discovery. One evening I was in the kitchen chopping vegetables for dinner when Daniel's voice startled me. Claire, he called from the living room. Yeah, I answered, trying to keep my tone steady. Why is Ian texting you so late? My hands froze mid-chop. The knife hovered over the cutting board as my mind scrambled for an explanation. The sounds of the cooking method receded in the distance, and the clatter of plates as I heaved a loaded, poisoned plate into my mouth. What do you mean? I asked, feigning innocence as I walked into the living room. Daniel held my phone, the screen lit up with a message from Ian. I miss you. My stomach dropped. I had forgotten to turn off the notifications, a careless mistake that now threatened to unravel everything. 17 more seconds. He was right. Daniel looked up at me, his brow furrowed. What's going on, Claire? It's nothing, I said quickly, reaching for the phone, but he pulled it away. Nothing? He repeated, his tone icy. Then why is my brother texting you that he misses you? It's not what you think, I said, my voice trembling. And then what is it? He demanded, standing now, his eyes locked onto mine. I opened my mouth, searching for the words, but the truth was there, hanging between us, undeniable. Daniel, I started, but the tears streaming down my face said more than my words ever could. In recent years. The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel stared at me, his expression a mix of disbelief and pain. How long, he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. It's not like that, I stammered, but he cut me off. How long? A few weeks, I admitted, my voice breaking. He let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. A few weeks. And you thought that was okay? That you could just betray me, betray us, and I wouldn't notice? I didn't mean for it to happen, I said desperately. Don't you dare say it just happened, he snapped, his voice rising. You made a choice, Claire. You chose him over me. His words hit me like a physical blow, and I sank onto the couch, my hands shaking. I didn't choose him, I whispered. I don't even know what I want anymore. Daniel stared at me, his jaw clenched. Well, you better figure it out, he said coldly, because as far as I'm concerned, There's no coming back from this. Ian's arrival. The next day, Ian showed up at the house, his expression tense. I had told him about Daniel's discovery in a tearful phone call the night before, and now he was here, determined to face the fallout. Daniel was sitting in the living room when Ian walked in, and the tension was immediate. "What are you doing here?" Daniel asked, his tone laced with anger. "I came to talk," Ian said, his voice calm but firm. "Talk?" Daniel repeated, standing. "You think there's anything to say after what you've done?" "Daniel," Ian started, but Daniel stepped closer, his fists clenched. "You're my brother," he said, his voice shaking with rage. "How could you do this to me? To us?" "I didn't plan for this to happen," Ian said, his tone filled with regret. "But I'm not going to apologize for how I feel." Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "How you feel? That's what this is about? Your feelings?" "It's more complicated than that," Ian said. "No, it's not," Daniel snapped. "You're selfish, both of you. You didn't care about the damage you'd cause the people you'd hurt." I stepped between them, my voice trembling. "Please, stop. This isn't helping." Daniel turned to me, his eyes filled with betrayal. "You don't get to play the peacemaker, Claire. You caused this." His words stung, but they were the truth. The aftermath. That night, Daniel packed a bag and left. He didn't say where he was going or when he'd be back. As I watched him walk out the door, a part of me wanted to run after him, to beg him to stay. But another part, the part that had been drawn to Ian, held me back. Ian stayed, his presence both a comfort and a reminder of everything that had fallen apart. "What now?" I asked him, as we sat in the silence of the living room. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm not going anywhere." His words were meant to reassure me, but they only deepened the ache in my chest. The beginning of the end. The days that followed were a blur of avoidance and tension. Daniel didn't return, and his absence was a constant reminder of the damage I had caused. Ian tried to be there for me, but our connection, once so exhilarating, now felt fragile, weighed down by guilt and uncertainty. And then, one evening, Daniel called. "I'll be back to get my things," he said, his voice cold. "I think it's best if we both move on." His words were a knife to my heart, but I knew he was right. The life we had built together was over, shattered by the choices I had made. Daniel's call haunted me long after I hung up. His voice, so cold, so final, was a stark contrast to the warmth we had once shared. I sat on the edge of the bed, the silence of the house pressing down on me like a heavy weight. Ian was in the kitchen, the sound of his pacing faint but constant. I knew he was giving me space, but even from a distance, his presence was inescapable. I had never felt so torn. My life was unraveling faster than I could grasp, and I was caught in the middle of the wreckage, unsure of which pieces to pick up and which to let go. Daniel returns. The next afternoon, I heard the familiar sound of Daniel's car pulling into the driveway. My heart leaped into my throat as I peeked out the window, watching him step out, his expression unreadable. He didn't have his usual suitcase, just a small duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Ian was standing by the kitchen counter when Daniel walked in. The two of them locked eyes, and the tension in the air was palpable. "I'm not here to fight," Daniel said, his voice flat. "I just want to get my things and go." Ian opened his mouth to respond, but I stepped between them. "Daniel, please," I said, my voice trembling. "Can we talk? Just for a minute?" There's nothing left to say," he said, brushing past me toward the stairs. I followed him, my heart racing. "I know you're angry." "Angry?" he interrupted, turning to face me. "Angry doesn't even begin to cover it, Claire. I trusted you. I trusted him. And now I don't even recognize the life I thought we had. It's gone." His words stung, each one a dagger to my already fractured heart. "I never wanted to hurt you," I said, tears streaming down my face. He frowned. "Are you okay?" "But you did," he said, his voice cracking, "and I can't forget that. A choice to make." After Daniel left, the house felt even emptier than before. Ian sat beside me on the couch, his hand resting on mine. "He'll never forgive me," I said softly. "Maybe not," Ian said, "but you can't let that define you." I turned to look at him, searching his face for answers. "What do I do now?" "You figure out what you want," he said simply. "Not for Daniel, not for me, for yourself." His words stayed with me long after he left that night. I spent hours pacing the house, replaying every moment, every choice, every misstep that had led me here. And slowly, painfully, I realized that Ian was right. I couldn't live my life defined by guilt and regret. I had to decide what kind of future I wanted, even if it meant letting go of the past. A meeting with Daniel. A week later, I called Daniel and asked to meet. He was hesitant at first, but eventually he agreed. We met at a park, a neutral ground where the echoes of our shared life couldn't haunt us, and our hair. He sat on a bench, his posture stiff, his expression guarded. I took a seat beside him, the weight of the moment heavy between us. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," I began, my voice steady despite the knot in my stomach. "I know what I did was wrong, and I'll carry that regret with me for the rest of my life." He didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "But I also know that what happened, it wasn't just about Ian. It was about us, about the distance that's been growing between us for years." His jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "I love you, Daniel," I said, my voice breaking. "And part of me always will. But somewhere along the way, we lost each other. And I think maybe it's time we stop trying to hold on to something that's already gone." He turned to look at me then, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and acceptance. "I think you're right," he said quietly. "We've both been holding on for the wrong reasons." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our shared history pressing down on us, and then, slowly, we began to let it go. A final goodbye. The next day, Daniel came to the house to collect the last of his things. This time, there was no anger, no bitterness, just a quiet understanding that our chapter had come to an end. As he stood by the door, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder, he turned to me one last time. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Claire," he said. "Me too," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. And with that, he was gone. A new beginning. In the days that followed, the house felt like a blank slate, a place where I could start over, free from the weight of my past. Ian called, asking if I needed anything, but I told him I needed time. "When were you going?" I asked. For the first time in months, I was truly alone, and while it was terrifying, it was also liberating. I spent my days rediscovering who I was outside of my roles as a wife, a lover, a secret keeper. Ian was patient, giving me the space I needed. And when I was ready, I called him. We met at the same park where I had said goodbye to Daniel. This time, the air felt different, lighter, filled with the promise of something new. "I wasn't sure you'd call," Ian said, his voice hesitant. "I wasn't sure I would either," I admitted. He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. "What now?" I smiled. The first genuine smile in what felt like forever. Now, the house no longer felt like a prison. The rooms were quiet, but not suffocatingly so. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. The weight of guilt and deceit that had hung over me was gone, replaced by the bittersweet relief of starting over. The life I had known was in ruins, but from those ruins I was slowly building something new. A cautious reunion. He and I didn't dive headfirst into our relationship after my call. We took things slowly, carefully, knowing that the path we were on wasn't one paved with guarantees. There was too much history, too much pain, and too many unresolved questions to pretend we could just pick up where we left off. Our first meeting after that call was at his apartment. It was small but cozy, a space that felt distinctly his. As I stepped inside, I was struck by how different it felt from the home I had shared with Daniel. We passed through the living room. "Thanks for coming," Ian said, his voice soft as he closed the door behind me. "I almost didn't," I admitted, turning to face him. "But you did," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "That's what matters." We sat on his couch, the silence between us heavy, but not uncomfortable. "So what now?" he asked, echoing the question he had asked me weeks ago. I hesitated, my hands fidgeting in my lap. "I don't know, I want to figure out who I am, Ian, outside of everything that's happened, outside of Daniel, and even outside of you." He nodded, his expression serious. "I get that, and I'm not going anywhere." His words were a comfort, but they were also a reminder that I couldn't rely on him to fix me. This was a journey I had to take on my own, even if he was there to walk beside me, confronting the past. Not everyone was as understanding as Ian. Word of what had happened eventually reached Daniel's family, and the fallout was inevitable. I had always been close with Daniel's mother, Margaret, and when she called to talk, I knew it wasn't going to be easy. "Claire," she said, her voice clipped, "I just don't understand. How could you do this? To Daniel, to our family?" "I don't expect you to understand," I said, my voice trembling, but it wasn't about hurting anyone. It was about finding something I had lost. "Ah, finding what?" she snapped. "What could you possibly have been missing that made this okay?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I don't have an answer for that yet, but I'm trying to figure it out." She sighed, the disappointment in her voice palpable. "You've caused so much pain, Claire. I hope you realize that." "I do," I said softly, "and I'll carry that with me forever." Moving forward, the weeks turned into months, and slowly life began to take shape again. I started seeing a therapist, someone who helped me unpack the choices I had made and the emotions that had driven them. It was painful work, but it was also freeing, like peeling back layers of armor I no longer needed. Ian was patient, always there when I needed him, but never pushing me to move faster than I was ready. We spent time together in quiet moments, long walks, late-night conversations, even simple dinners at his apartment. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, but something deeper and steadier, built on a foundation of honesty that had been sorely lacking before. A meeting with Daniel. One day, I received a call I hadn't expected. Daniel wanted to meet. We met at a coffee shop, the same one where this all had nearly unraveled months ago. He looked different, calmer, lighter somehow. "How are you?" I asked as we sat down. "I'm okay," he said, nodding slowly. "Better, actually. I've been seeing someone." I shrugged. His words caught me off guard, but they also brought a surprising sense of relief. That's good," I said, meaning it. "And you?" he asked, his tone genuine. "I'm figuring things out," I said honestly. He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I'm glad. I hope you find what you're looking for, Claire." For the first time in months, I felt like we were on the same page. Two people who had shared a life, but were now walking separate paths. A new chapter. Months turned into a year, and slowly, my life began to feel like my own again. Ian and I grew closer, but our relationship was different now, built on a foundation of truth rather than secrecy. One evening, as we sat on his balcony watching the sunset, he turned to me, his expression serious. "Izzy?" said I. "Do you regret it?" he asked softly. "Regret what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Thus, how it started, everything we went through to get here." I thought about it for a moment, my gaze drifting to the horizon. "I regret the hurt we caused," I said finally. "But I don't regret finding you." He reached for my hand, his touch warm and steady. "I don't either." The final reflection. Life didn't magically fall into place after everything that had happened. There were still moments of doubt, moments when I wondered if I had made the right choices. But there were also moments of clarity, moments when I felt like I was finally living a life that was true to myself. As I stood in my living room one evening, the sunlight streaming through the windows, I realized that I was no longer the person I had been a year ago. I was stronger now, more honest, and more willing to face the complexities of life head on. And while the road ahead was still uncertain, I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't afraid to walk it. The fallout from my choices was like a ripple spreading through every part of my life. The confession, the confrontation, and Daniel's departure left a gaping hole in what had once been a predictable, if hollow, existence. Ian stayed, as he promised he would, but his presence didn't erase the guilt or the questions I still had about myself. Instead, it brought clarity. If I didn't address the cracks in my foundation, I would only repeat the cycle of hurt. Picking up the pieces. The first step was solitude. I asked Ian to give me space, something he surprisingly accepted without argument. "I'll wait as long as you need," he said, his tone steady. But the way his eyes lingered on mine told me he was afraid I wouldn't come back. The silence in the house was almost unbearable at first. Without Daniel, without Ian, and without the distractions of a busy life, I was left alone with my thoughts. Days blurred together as I tried to make sense of everything. How my marriage had unraveled, why I had sought solace in Ian, and what I truly wanted moving forward. And to journal, writing out every thought, every regret, and every moment I had avoided confronting. It was messy and painful, but it brought clarity. I had spent so much of my life trying to meet the expectations of others, being the supportive wife, the dutiful family member. the woman who always kept things together. Somewhere along the way, I had lost sight of who I was. A conversation with Daniel. 3 weeks after Daniel left, I received a text from him. Can we talk? We met at a neutral location, a park we had frequented when we were first dating. It felt strange to see him there, sitting on a bench with the same posture he'd had years ago when he first asked me to marry him. Thanks for coming, he said as I approached, his voice calm but guarded. I didn't think I'd hear from you again, I admitted, sitting beside him. I needed time to process, he said, folding his hands in his lap. But I also realized I needed closure. I nodded, my heart heavy with the weight of his words. I owe you an explanation, I began, my voice trembling. Not just for what happened with Ian, but for everything that led up to it. Daniel stayed silent, his eyes focused on the ground as I spoke. I told him about the loneliness I had felt in our marriage, the growing distance that neither of us had acknowledged, and the emptiness that had left me vulnerable to Ian's attention. I'm not excusing what I did, I said, tears streaming down my face. I need you to know it wasn't about hurting you. It was about trying to fill something that was missing in myself. Daniel finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and understanding. I wasn't perfect either, he admitted. I let work take over my life, and I ignored the signs that you were unhappy. But Claire, you could have told me. You could have given me the chance to fix things. I know, I said softly, and I'm so sorry I didn't. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of our shared history hanging between us. Finally, Daniel spoke again. I think it's best if we both move on, he said, his voice steady. We can't go back to what we had, and trying to would only hurt us more. His words were a bittersweet relief. They gave me permission to let go of the guilt and the hope of reconciliation that I had been clinging to, rebuilding trust with myself. With Daniel gone, I turned my focus inward. Therapy became a lifeline, a place where I could unpack not just my actions, but the underlying patterns that had led me to that point. My therapist helped me see how much of my life had been shaped by fear. Fear of being alone, fear of failure, fear of disappointing others. One session she asked me a question that stuck with me. What would it look like if you lived for yourself instead of for the expectations of others? I didn't have an answer then, but I carried the question with me, using it as a guide for every decision I made moving forward. Reconnecting with Ian. After months of solitude, I reached out to Ian. The silence between us had been necessary, but I missed him in a way that felt deeper than just physical attraction. He had been a constant presence during the most turbulent time in my life, and I wanted to see if there was a way for us to move forward, not as a secret, but as something real. We met at his apartment, the atmosphere tense but hopeful. I didn't think I'd hear from you, he admitted as he opened the door. I needed time, I said, stepping inside. Time to figure out who I am and what I want. And, he asked, his voice cautious, and I realized that what I want includes you, I said, my voice steady. Relief washed over his face, but he didn't rush toward me. Instead, he sat down, his eyes searching mine. I don't want to hurt you, Claire, or myself. If we're going to do this, it has to be different. I know, I said, sitting beside him. It will be. The new relationship. Ian and I took things slowly. building a relationship that was free from the lies and secrecy that had defined the beginning. We had hard conversations about trust, boundaries, and what we wanted for the future. It wasn't easy. There were moments of doubt, moments when the weight of our past threatened to overshadow our present, but we faced them together, determined to make it work. Finding myself again. In the midst of rebuilding my relationship with Ian, I also worked on rebuilding my relationship with myself. I took up hobbies I had abandoned years ago, reconnected with old friends, and even started a new job that reignited a passion I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I wasn't living for anyone else, not for Daniel, not for Ian, not for the expectations of society. I was living for me, a meeting of the past and present. One evening, I ran into Daniel at a mutual friend's event. He looked happy, his arm around a woman I didn't recognize. We exchanged polite smiles, and when he approached me later, there was no bitterness in his voice. "You look good," he said, his tone warm. "So do you," I replied, meaning it. We chatted briefly, the conversation light and easy. As he walked away, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't realized I needed. A new beginning. That night, Ian and I sat on the balcony of his apartment, the city lights twinkling in the distance. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" I asked, leaning into him. "Every day," he said, wrapping his arm around me. We sat in comfortable silence, the weight of our past no longer a burden, but a reminder of how much we had grown. For the first time in a long time, I felt at peace, not because life was perfect, but because I had finally found the strength to face it on my own terms. As I stand here now, reflecting on the journey that brought me to this moment, I am filled with a bittersweet sense of gratitude. It wasn't an easy road, far from it. The choices I made, the hearts I hurt, and the life I left behind all came at a cost. But every step, every misstep led me to where I am today. And while the scars of the past remain, they have shaped me into someone stronger, someone who no longer hides from the truth. Saying goodbye to Daniel was one of the hardest things I've ever done. He wasn't just my husband, he was my partner, my friend, and the person who shared my life for so many years. Letting go of that was like losing a part of myself. But sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to walk away. I hope he finds the happiness he deserves, just as I am learning to find mine. Ian and I have started to build something new, something real. It's not perfect, and it's certainly not without its challenges. But for the first time, we are honest with each other and with ourselves. We know that what we share comes with a history, a weight that we must carry together. Yet that weight no longer feels like a burden. It feels like a reminder of how far we've come and how much we've learned. But beyond Ian, beyond Daniel, this journey has been about me. For so long, I defined myself by my roles: wife, sister-in-law, caretaker, peacemaker. I lived for others, trying to meet their expectations, trying to be the person they needed me to be. In the process, I lost sight of who I was. Now I am finally rediscovering her. I am learning to embrace my flaws, my desires, and my dreams without shame. Life is messy, it's full of mistakes and regrets, but it's also full of second chances. And while I can't erase the pain I caused, I can choose to grow from it. I can choose to be better. Not perfect, but better. That's the promise I've made to myself, and it's a promise I intend to keep. To anyone listening to this story, I hope it reminds you that it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to stumble, to fall, and to question the life you've built. What matters is what you do next. Do you stay stuck in the past, or do you find the courage to move forward? Do you let your mistakes define you, or do you let them teach you? For me, the answer is clear. I choose growth. I choose honesty. I choose to live a life that feels authentic, even if it's not always easy. And in doing so, I've found something I thought I had lost forever: myself. This isn't the end of my story. It's just the beginning of a new chapter. And for that, I am endlessly grateful. I wish I could say I didn't know what was happening, but I did. The lines between us blurred with every touch, every stolen glance, and every conversation that lingered too long. I told myself it would go no further, that I could stop it before it crossed into something irreparable. But one moment of weakness, one kiss, shattered any illusion of control I had. From there, the line was crossed again and again, until we were both tangled in something we couldn't undo. The day Daniel found out was one of the worst of my life. The look on his face, the pain in his voice still haunts me. I tried to explain, to make him understand, but how could I? How do you justify betraying someone who trusted you? There were no excuses, no reasons that could make it right. In that moment, I knew I had lost not just my husband, but the life we had built together. And Ian? He stayed, even when I asked him for space. He didn't run, even when I doubted myself, doubted us. But what I've learned in all of this is that I can't define myself by my relationships, not with Daniel, not with Ian. I needed to face my own brokenness, to find out who I was beyond the roles I had played for so long. This story doesn't have a happy ending, but it has an honest one. I've made mistakes, ones I will carry with me forever. But I've also found strength in the rubble, a chance to rebuild, not just my life, but myself. And for the first time, that feels like enough.